Afternoon, everybody. My name is David Higgins. I'm Director of Customer Development for CyberArk. Been at the company for just over 8 years now. And as per the title, my conversation today, my talk today is really going to be about what we call the privilege pathway, which is really looking at how attackers are using privileged credentials to actually perform lateral movement and pivot from machine to machine and ultimately end up at their objective. But because it's after lunch, which is always a dangerous session, I wanted to start with something a little bit light-hearted to hopefully try and wake people up a little bit. So I want to start with a video, and I'll give you the context of the video. It's kind of set the mindset of what a lot of post-breach organizations that we speak to are trying to achieve. So CyberArk as a vendor, we try to provide proactive security controls. We've never been in the kind of breach remediation business. That's not our focus. And historically, clients were adopting CyberArk for compliance reasons, audit reasons. PCI SOX kind of calls out for managing privileged users. But more and more recently, we found ourselves being dragged into post-breach situations because once an organization has been breached, they bring in a remediation company, looks at what's happened, and they see that privileged credentials were commonly used by the attackers in the process. And their objective kind of post-breach isn't to stop the attack, but is actually to isolate the attack. Because the mindset that they're having is the attackers are going to get in again. Someone is going to click on the wrong thing. Someone's going to open the wrong attachment. Someone's going to pick up a USB stick off the floor and plug it in. You know, human nature means that social engineering will exploit that human nature. So as I say, I wanted to start with a light-hearted video, which kind of hopefully demonstrates that quite clearly. You know, set context, my wife's a teacher, right? She doesn't know too much about IT security, but she knows that she shouldn't give out her password, right? That's something private and sensitive to her. She shouldn't be sharing that with other people. So even looking at, maybe a bit too much text on this slide, but looking at a guidance from Microsoft to remediate or prevent one of the common attack techniques used, especially in Active Directory, which is called pass the hash. I'll talk a bit about that later. They really talk about if you're starting to address this attack technique, this attack approach, really take that mindset of assume breach, as in what kind of security controls will be put in place on the assumption the attackers are already in the perimeter. They're already at that endpoint. And they're now trying to perform lateral movement, move from that endpoint to their objective. And it's based on that mindset that, you know, even the most savvy user will do the wrong thing. This screenshot's actually from a malware attack that was focused at IT administrators, so individuals who should know better, shouldn't click on the wrong link, open the wrong attachment. The particular attack had an Office document attached to it, and it had a macro within it, right? So you know if you open an Office document with a macro in it, it prompts you to say, do you really want to run this? It could be bad for you. And in this particular attack, an IT admin opened the attachment and then accepted the warning for the macro, right? It's that assumption they're going to get in. So what can we do to prevent them moving laterally? So getting from this particular breach endpoint, finding a credential and then moving to the next layer, to the infrastructure, and ultimately getting access to their critical asset, whatever that asset may be. It may be a database, it may be a domain controller, it may be a service that the attackers want to take down. But what we see in a lot of those attacks that we kind of investigated afterwards is this lateral movement, the ability for an attacker to steal a credential, perform a movement to another device, happens on average over 10 times. Right? And in fact, if any of you saw the reports out of the Bangladesh Central Bank heist, that happened. The reports coming out of that is that this lateral movement happened 32 times before the attackers got onto the Swift infrastructure. That's essentially the target of that attack. So it's happened very commonly. And one of the techniques that we see used, especially in Windows, is something called pass the hash. So let's take a scenario here that the attackers have sent some form of phishing attack. That's the most common process that we see at the start of attack. What they do, actually, I talked about IT admins, but actually commonly we see them focus at salespeople or marketing people, because they're a little bit more liberal about what they're going to click on, what they're going to open, right? Not as diligent maybe as the IT folk. So they focus on that. So let's say we've got someone in marketing that's clicked on the wrong attachment. Now there's some form of payload deposited on that machine. What they start to do is they look for a credential on that workstation that's going to allow them to connect to either another workstation or ideally to a server, something in the infrastructure. But that marketing user's AD credential has no permissions outside of their own workstation. It can't access anywhere. Because what they'll do is they'll try to use a technique called pass the hash, which is on the premise that in Windows, when you log into your workstation or a server, your credential is hashed locally on the machine, either in memory or locally. Now, if you log on to multiple devices with the same credential, it's a one-way algorithm. Same input produces the same output. So the same hash then resides on these multiple devices. Attackers can use easily accessible tools off the internet, tools like Mimikatz, that allow you to extract that hash credential and pass it to another machine where the user logged on before. It's called pass the hash. You don't need to brute force the password. You don't need to know the password. You just need that hash. Okay, it's called pass the hash. Now, in this case, if we got a marketing user, it's probably not going to give us access to anything. They've probably not accessed any other device. So what they might do is start filling up the C drive, right? And what happens when the C drive starts to fill up is the device starts to slow down. So what does that marketing user do? Well, they call the desktop support team. Desktop support team will now probably log in with a -A account or a -ADM account, their secondary account that was created for admin functions. So what now happens is a hash is now deposited on that endpoint that's going to give the attackers the ability to pivot and either move to additional endpoints or ideally start moving to the infrastructure, because that desktop support user has to access and support antivirus and the backup solutions, which all, of course, runs on servers. And the process repeats. They get onto another device, maybe they look for more hash credentials, or maybe they look for credentials in code and script. Many different processes they may go through, but ultimately looking to get credentials that are going to allow them to get to that critical asset. Now in the title, we talk about kind of network takeover or domain takeover, because we often see an objective is for the attackers to carry out something called a golden ticket attack, which is basically introduces a sub-objective of trying to get to one of your domain controllers. So they try to find a credential, maybe after multiple hops, that gives them admin access to a domain controller. And really, whenever we look at this, the attackers are after two things. They need network access to an objective or sub-objective, and they need a credential that's going to allow them to get to that device. Now, in this case, if they get admin access to a domain controller, as I say, they can invoke this attack called golden ticket. Now, what golden ticket basically allows an attacker to do once they invoke it, they steal a file off the domain controller, and when within it is a Kerberos signing ticket that they use, they can now impersonate anybody in that domain. All right. They can basically make a request, they can sign it with this ticket that they've stolen from the domain controller and say, I want to be David Higgins and I want full admin access to this server. And because it's been signed with the appropriate ticket, the receiving server will accept it, allow the user to connect. And when you look at the OS logs from a monitoring perspective, there is no difference between that and a legitimate connection. All right, you can't tell the difference between the two access. More worryingly, but probably not used very often in an attack, they can make up the user because they're signing with a ticket. They could say, I'm Mickey Mouse and I want to connect to your server with admin rights. And they sign it with that ticket, and the receiving server says, yep, on you come, Mickey. You are now a full admin on the server. Hopefully, monitoring would pick that up, that Mickey Mouse is on the server, right? So they're usually impersonating trusted employees when they're doing this. But the reason this might be an objective is once they can take over the domain, think of all the devices, the system services that we connect to Active Directory. Exchange is an obvious example, but VMware, et cetera, all the federated and authenticated systems that rely on Active Directory, they can now start to access. One of the attacks we saw is the attackers got onto the Exchange server after performing this, so they could start reading the emails, and they were only interested in emails from certain employees. That was the security team. Because as soon as the security team started to notice some alerts going off, some abnormal behavior, what do security teams do? Well, you email your colleagues. I've just seen this, I'm going to try X, Y, and Z to see what happens. The attackers are seeing these emails. So they're one step ahead now of the security team, because they're able to see all the communication that's taking place. So taking over the domain is a key sub-objective because it allows them to do so much more to get to their final objective. Okay. In this situation, Microsoft originally didn't have a process for remediating golden ticket, so most organizations, once the victim of this, would have to rebuild the AD and kind of start again. They do now have a documented process of resetting that ticket I talked about. You can reset it twice. But generally, the advice that we see being given to clients in this situation is, again, still rebuild, start again, to ensure you can trust the authentication that's happening within your AD. So what I want to talk about is not just all doom and gloom, right? Talk about some best practices, what we do in those situations. I mentioned we're getting involved more and more kind of post-breach, being asked by clients to come on site and start securing the privileged access to their systems as they start to rebuild them in light of an attack. And what we've done in kind of light of all that experience is we've built this, what we call PAS Hygiene, Privileged Account Security Hygiene Program. And it comprises of 7 simple steps. Clients may not necessarily follow in these order, so you don't have to look at them as being sequential. But these are quick things that we can do in that kind of situation to start to address the risk associated with privilege compromise and to reduce the risk of accounts being stolen. And the reason we do this is, one, first of all, of course, we want to prevent that from happening. But secondly, in the privileged account security space, many organizations say, right, we've got to do privileged account access management for whatever reasons, compliance, audit, et cetera, and we're going to do it for Windows. And that's quite a broad statement to make, because when you look at Windows, it's not just local admin accounts and service accounts, it's application accounts, it's domain admin, enterprise admin, it's named administrative accounts as well. It's a very broad scope, and there's lots of different use cases of accounts being used in there. So many organizations can spend so much time designing the whole process, how we're going to cope with all those different accounts, that whilst we're spending that time, there's still a risk of accounts being compromised. So this is all about focusing on low operational impact accounts, as I call it, which are accounts that aren't being used maybe day to day, or there aren't a large number of them. So we know it doesn't matter which organization we go to, we're going to see these kinds of accounts, and therefore we can follow a standard process to manage them. So what does this kind of look like from a kind of controls perspective? So what we do in a post-breach situation is we don't start at the endpoint, we actually start here at the critical asset, so the domain controller. And we talk about what can we do to prevent happening, what I was just explaining. And the first thing that we really talk about is to start managing those domain admin and enterprise admin accounts. So what we mean by that is kind of putting them in a digital vault and getting those credentials rotated on a regular basis, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, but also importantly after use. Ideally, after every time those credentials are used, they should be rotated. Or if not, what we can do is maybe rotate them every day, because that is the simplest way to break the pass-the-hash attack process. Regular rotation of credentials invalidates the hashes deposited on machines. So if we rotate them every day, then we're breaking those hashes that have been dropped around from the activity that day with that account. As I say, ideally, we'd do it after every use, but that might be too much of a change to do kind of day one. We also look to immediately implement the ability to detect. Once we've cleaned the domain, obviously it's been rebuilt, we're now locking those accounts, it's important to detect if anyone tries it again. And the way that we do that is actually inspecting the Kerberos traffic going to and from the domain controllers. As I say, you can't do it from the OS logs. All right? So actually we do it by inspecting that Kerberos tracker, and we can detect if a ticket or a Kerberos packet, has been signed with a stolen ticket or actually done the appropriate manner. Strangely, we also do application control at this stage on a domain controller. Usually when we talk about application control, whitelisting, blacklisting, most people are talking about the endpoint, right? What applications we want to allow our end users to implement. But in these situations with clients that say, we don't want to allow certain things like PS exec ever running on a domain controller. We don't want PS exec to ever run on our DCs. So implementing application control can stop that from happening, and therefore if you stop some of the techniques that attackers are using once running these boxes. All right. Also, I've got a note here about enforced tiered account model. I'll jump to this next slide to explain it. So once upon a time, Microsoft's recommendation was for your admins, best practice is 2 accounts. One for my day-to-day activity, accessing email, accessing Exchange. And then if I'm supporting servers and systems and I need admin access, I'd have a secondary account for that. And that's what the -A or -ADM account I talked about. Usually I see the naming convention of the user's name, hyphen some kind of suffix that denotes it's an admin level account. In light of what we're seeing happening, they're suggesting a different model now. And the reason for that is those -A accounts, if I'm logging onto a workstation and in a server, and then maybe also a domain controller, I'm depositing hashes in multiple places. So this image is taken from that pass-the-hash document I mentioned at the very start, and they talk about now implementing 3 tiers. Different set of accounts for administrating your workstations, different set of accounts for administrating your servers, and then obviously a third set for the domain controllers. The premise being, if I can get hold of a workstation admin credential, it doesn't give me access to the server stack. Similarly, if I'm on the server stack and I find a credential, it doesn't give me access to the domain controllers. These accounts shouldn't be accessing each of the tiers. So it's a very good way to, again, isolate that attack, to prevent that lateral movement from the endpoint, but it proposes an operational challenge. Now instead of having 2 accounts, I've got 3 accounts, or maybe 4 accounts. So again, this is where we talk about vaulting those credentials, because we can provide a kind of privileged single sign-on, if you will, for your users. They come into the vault, they request the level of access they need, admin to workstation, server, etc., and then the vault will connect them to that particular system with that particular credential. They don't need to remember all these multitude of passwords now. As a second phase, moving to the second step, we then focus on the well-known admin accounts. As I say, there's lots of different privileged accounts out there. Services, applications, the list goes on, right? But we know for every Windows box you install, every Unix box you install, every database you install, a network device, there is inbuilt a system administrative account. All right? Doesn't matter where in the world we go, that is the case, right? And in many situations, we see that the password is set as part of the server build process. So what that means is on every workstation, the local administrator password may be set to the same value. On the servers, it may be set to the set value. You know, I remember speaking to an organization who had a Unix admin who was a contractor. He stopped his contract. He went to travel the world for a year, find himself, whatever it may be. He came back a year later to the same organization. The day he was back, he could start logging back on his route because the password hadn't changed on any of the servers and it was still set to the same memorable password like let me in or password with a 4 instead of an A, right? That's very common to see. So the next stage we talk about is taking these admin accounts, vault them, get them rotated, and get them set to strong random passwords for every instance of an account on a device. And this is something we can achieve relatively easily because typically, especially admin in Windows, right, these aren't used on a day-to-day basis by the teams. So when I talk about that operational impact, we're not changing the way that they behave too much, but what we are doing is slowly introducing them to the technology, as opposed to saying, we're going to take your named admin account day one, vault that, and you've got to come here straight away multiple times a day. So it gradually introduces them to the change, whilst also, of course, addressing a big risk here. Now, something you also see on the slide is it's talking about this session isolation. I mentioned really at the start, attackers need two things. They need a credential. We're starting to address that by vaulting and rotating. But they need access as well. They need to be able to go from their ingress point. They need essentially a network connection to wherever they want to move to. Now, we talk about session isolation, so isolating those exposed endpoints, because they've got internet access, making them exposed, from the critical assets or from the application systems. And we do this with a broker. So rather than actually giving the password to the end user, because if that endpoint, for example, has some kind of keystroke logger on it, and we give the user the password and they type it into RDP or they type it into PuTTY, well, the password's still going to leave, right? The attackers are still going to get hold of that. Whereas what we do with this brokering process is they click a connect button and actually they get sent to a broker. The broker retrieves the password from the vault, launches the session, RDP, PuTTY, vSphere client, Internet Explorer, whatever it may be, injects the credentials into the session, and then connects the user to the target asset. They never need direct access in this process. And it may be, some organizations we speak to, they want to do this for every access. Everything should be brokered. Others will say, we want to do this for our critical assets, for our crown jewels. Okay? It also means it's very beneficial when you talk about third parties. By doing this session isolation and brokering, third parties no longer need direct access to any of the systems they're supporting. They get a VPN connection in, and then they just need to access the broker to get connections to wherever they're supporting. And then, a third stage, and the reason it's a third stage is we then do start to focus on the endpoint. We start to focus on what is happening on these endpoints that's allowing attackers to implement malware and actually steal credentials and pivot and move. So we talk about, obviously, removing administrative access. I know many organizations are looking at that. It's clearly a best practice. Remove admin rights from the endpoints. In that situation, sometimes there's always an exception to policy. The developers may be still giving admin access because they're always finding weird applications to install. The IT admins might be giving exceptions to policy because, again, they're installing lots of weird stuff, so we can't do whitelisting and blacklisting very easily. What we do here, though, actually, is we implement a concept called grey listing, which basically says we don't want anyone to have local admin access on their endpoint. But we understand that there's going to be applications installing all the time that we maybe can't whitelist or blacklist. So what we do is we grey list it, which basically means we contain it until we know whether it's good or bad. So let's take ransomware as an example, right? The first thing many ransomware, not all, but many ransomware will do is it will want to call home, i.e. need an internet connection, to get an encryption key that it's then going to use to encrypt the files on that device. And ideally, it would do that for every device it infects because that's a different encryption key for each device, and it amplifies, obviously, the potential cost of fixing that problem. Then what it might do is it might look at registry to disable AV or malware that's running on the device, anti-malware that's running on the device. And then it might want to access network shares because obviously it wants to really encrypt as much as it possibly can. And ultimately, right, what is it doing? It's a process that needs permissions to files. It's a process that needs modify rights to files. So what we do with grey listing is we say, well, we're not going to give it internet access. We're not going to allow it to access certain areas of registry. And we're not going to allow it to access network shares. And also, we're going to prevent it from having any write permissions, modified permissions, to PPTX files, to doc.x files, PDF files, whatever it may be. And by doing that, and we're not an anti-ransomware vendor by any means, but by doing that, we found that we've been able to block over, I think it's 150,000 now variants of ransomware by implementing those processes. Okay? And it's all, the initial objective was really all about preventing lateral movement from here. But we found by doing it that actually we can also stop ransomware because it's simply a case of permissions and access. That ransomware process needs to access files. So this would be a typical third step if we can, because then we can actually start to really enforce that lateral movement. What we're also doing, by the way, is that we still do this first. The reason we do this first is we're addressing not only the external risk, we're doing it quickly. Obviously, endpoint management is more complex. That's why it's a third step. But we're also starting to address the insider threat. All right, so you can just go onto the internet, right? Google disgruntled IT administrator, and you'll see so many stories of a disgruntled IT admin who was overlooked for a promotion or a pay rise, and they've abused the fact that they can connect to systems whenever they want because there's no control around their access, and they go off deleting stuff or taking services down, or even in some cases accessing social media accounts and tweeting inappropriate things about that company. One organization we spoke to said, look, we're a fairly small company, so you won't hear about us in the news, but that's not the main reason you won't hear about us in the news. The main reason is we weren't targeted in the usual way by state-sponsored attackers or cyber criminals. What happened to us is our IT administrator sold our admin passwords on the dark web because he or she just simply knew what those passwords were. So by starting to take care of these credentials, we also address that insider threat as well. Okay. Now, a logical fourth step is something I want to come to, but I forgot the slide was here. This is actually the first, sorry, now I'm showing you product, apologies. So far I've been talking about process, but this is my unashamed plug of CyberArk tech. This is coming from the endpoint. This is actually where we're starting to focus on detecting credential theft. I didn't talk about it before, but one of the bullet points was blocking credential theft attempts. We know when an attacker gets on that endpoint, one of the first things they're going to look to do is start to steal and establish credentials. So when we have that endpoint agent that's also doing the least privilege and the application control, the other thing it's doing is it's blocking credential theft attempts. So here we just got a screenshot to say it's got some indicators. There's 3 risks. And when we drill down, it's actually going to give us information about the process. So it doesn't matter if this is an installed application, right? We're going to find out which process has attempted to perform some form of credential theft. In this case, it's actually saying, we know, LSAS dump is an approach attackers may do. I won't go into the technical ins and outs of it, but this is something attackers may do to get hold of credentials. The agent running the box will be able to detect that, block it, and raise an alert and send it, of course, to your SIEM solution to say something, and it tell you obviously the root, which user, which process, etc., has just tried to steal a credential. And it's not just LSAS, it's also things in like Chrome. It's relatively easy. Whenever you're setting a password, by the way, in Chrome, and it says, do you want to keep this password? It's relatively easy to actually get that password out of Chrome once you've cached it in there. So just a word of warning if you're doing that. It's really quite straightforward to steal that password. This is able to detect that. We're able to spot that activity and flag it. And the idea, as I say, it's all about that mindset. They're going to get on the endpoint, but let's stop them moving further from that point forward. Now, the fourth step that we also look at that was in the hygiene is look at the other kinds of accounts that are used. So far, I've talked about interactive accounts. I mentioned the scope of privilege is very broad. We have application accounts or system accounts. These are accounts being used by other programs, products that you've acquired, your own homegrown applications that want to connect to something and perform some functionality. And it's usually a privileged account it's using. I'll give you a great example. Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7, vulnerability scanners. They can do an authenticated scan or a non-authenticated scan. Now, ideally, it's an authenticated scan because what it's going to be able to do is find more vulnerabilities by doing that. But what it needs to do it is a privileged credential. And these privileged credentials will usually have a little tick next to them, say, non-expiring password, because once they're in these solutions, they can't rotate the password. We can't manage those passwords. But all the vendors that you see in the blue, and apologies, the number's growing, so it's actually getting smaller and smaller, each logo. But each of the vendors in blue is a vendor that we've worked with to secure the credentials that they need to use as part of their service. So actually we can store those credentials, we can vault them, we can get them rotated, and when they need them, they will call CyberArk and say, all right, I need that password now to start scanning the systems. And again, what we're starting to do is address accounts that have low operational risk. They're not used by the human users on a day-to-day basis, but they do pose a security risk. They're privileged accounts that are usually set to simple passwords and are usually set to non-expiring. We have a discovery tool that I'll talk about at the end, and we run it in clients to find out where privileged accounts are. And one of the things it does when it's scanning, say, accounts in Active Directory, is it will pull back the description field to say, I found this account, and this is the description of that account, just to give some context. We ran that in a particular organization, and it found a service account that had been created for a security product. I won't name the vendor. Had been created for a security vendor, and the name of the password was, the actual password value was written in the description field, and it was the name of the vendor. And they just changed E to a euro sign, right, to make it sound secure. No, a dollar sign, sorry, for an S. And that was in the description field. So it shows that these accounts are highly vulnerable. And in that situation, right, anyone with read permissions to AD actually could have got access to that account. So we very commonly see these accounts are not expiring, but they are privileged. And probably, sadly, they were set to something weak when the original engineer was on site doing the installation. We had a financial institution in the US approach us, because we have a red team, and they said, we've just moved to the cloud. We have a kind of cloud-first strategy. And we want to know if we're more secure or less secure now we've moved to the cloud. So our red team started the test. They started with a phishing attack, as always, and they managed to actually get an engineer to click on a link that deposited a payload on their workstation, and what we found on their workstation was an AWS access key. We didn't know what rights it had, so we used that AWS access key to connect into their AWS account, and from that position, we found out it actually had some privilege. All right, actually gives access to a large percentage of their EC2 instances. So we then spun up our own account. We then actually did a mapping of SE storage, and we used that key to take a copy of their systems and put it on our own account. So essentially, the team kind of stole a data center. 10 years ago, if you wanted to do that, you need a really big truck and lift up a building, put it on a truck. Now we just take an AWS access key, and we're able to access these systems. It's not necessarily specific to DevOps, but the use of these keys and secrets, it poses a different challenge. So we also look about vaulting those keys, vaulting those secrets, and providing secure mechanisms for these solutions to retrieve them as and when they need them. Okay. So just looking at time, we're doing all right. I just wanted to finish with some next steps, which is kind of what should you do next, right? So I've talked about some of the risks and some of the challenges. We have it's rare for a vendor to say, right? We have a free of charge discovery tool that will scan Windows, Unix, Linux, and AWS. And it comes back with a row-by-row report of all the privileged accounts and keys that we found on those systems, SSH keys, AWS access keys, and of course, local and domain-based accounts in Windows. It comes back with that row-by-row report. I don't have it here because there's a lot of text. It shows you when the account was last used, when the password was last changed, why it's privileged, sudo rights, group memberships in AD, etc. But what it also does is it highlights your vulnerability to some of the attacks that I mentioned. So it will also show your vulnerability to pass the hash. So here is something from our demo environment. Each box is a server, a workstation that was scanned. And what we're saying is if you click on one of those boxes in this map, it will say, this box is compromised. Where could an attacker move to? And that's what the arrows denote. This is where an attacker could move to in the environment if they compromise this box. And it will show you the accounts that actually be part of that compromise. So this is from a demo environment. What I'll show you next is from a real-life situation. Right? This was created by service accounts that were set with interactive, they were allowed for interactive logon, and they were set to non-expiring passwords. And in this case, that organization had hashes all over the place for non-changing passwords. Passwords being 5,000 days old, 2,000 days old, that's not uncommon for us to find that, right? So this image, again, isn't surprising when we see it. Compromising one box essentially compromises the entirety of that domain, or allows the attacker to move very freely to other systems. The other thing it'll do is also show the kind of jump points to your domain controllers, which systems would actually allow a golden ticket attack to take place, and again, which potential credentials would be used as part of that. As I say, it's free of charge to use. It runs on a workstation or a server. Ironically, and I'll call it out, ironically, to find privileged accounts, we need a privileged account, so you have to give it a privileged account to run. But as I say, it runs within the isolation. It doesn't call home. It doesn't need internet access for us. And it comes back with this detailed report. And it really helps give a view of where you are right now with your state of privileged accounts. And it's also something our existing customers will run on a periodic basis, maybe every 6 months. It becomes a kind of before and after shot, right? In like a diet photo, right? This is us before, not looking too great. 6 months of implementing some of those steps I talked about. We then run it again. And in theory, this image should be reduced in terms of a risk. Okay. So last thing for me to do is really thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate your time. We're just based over there, so if you have any questions or you want a copy of the DNA product I mentioned, come and have a chat to us and we can get you signed up for that, no problem at all. But again, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it after lunch.